In this course, we're going to talk about how do we secure operational technology and industrial control system environments like power plants, water treatment facilities, or manufacturing plants that create my favorite candy. Idea is we have to protect these environments from attacks that could impact the availability of those plants. What would happen if a power plant goes down for a couple of hours or a couple of days where we don't have power? What about a couple of weeks or a couple of months? So you start to see the impact that cyber attacks can have in the world around us, and especially those services that our families, our friends, our communities rely on in their daily lives. And it doesn't matter where in the world we live. And so it doesn't matter whether you're coming from an IT or an IT cybersecurity background, or you're coming from an engineering or an OT or an automation background. We need everybody to learn how to defend these environments. These environments, yes, they're designed and they're very complex and complicated in that design, but at the same time, defending them doesn't have to be complex or complicated. And that's what we're going to talk about in this course. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that everything we talk about in this course is for informational and educational knowledge. And we're going to be talking about how cyber attacks can impact OT or ICS environments, as well as how we can prevent those attacks from occurring. But the whole point is that you're using this information for the forces of good and not for the forces of evil. Everything we also talk about, it's my own personal opinion. It's from me, myself, and I, and not from any organizations that I'm affiliated with. And that when we start talking about performing any type of active testing, even something as simple as a network port scan, that you have to make sure not only do you have authorization to be doing that testing, but you've worked with the appropriate team members, like in engineering and operations, to sign off on that activity to ensure that you don't impact the safety or the availability of the environment. And then as you go along, if you have questions, make sure to drop them in the comments. If you have a question, more than likely somebody else has the same question. So if you post them in the comments, I'll be able to respond, provide an answer, and then that way we can share out that information with everybody that's actually going through the course. Real quickly, I wanted to introduce myself. My name's Mike Holcomb, and I work in helping people understand how to secure OT and ICS environments. I'm very fortunate to work with clients in the field, like in power plants and water treatment facilities or manufacturing plants, to be able to help better secure those environments and then also help others learn how to secure those environments, which is why we're here. I spent 15 years at one of the world's largest engineering and construction companies. Right? We built and designed, engineered some of the world's largest OT and ICS environments. And I was fortunate to work with some of the best engineering minds in the world to build out not only the OT ICS cybersecurity program for the company, but to be able to work with our clients on their needs for control system cybersecurity as well. Besides that work, I founded the local B-Sides conference here in Greenville, South Carolina, about 10 years ago, and ran that until recently, where I now focus on B-Sides ICS, which is an OT ICS specific version of the B-Sides cybersecurity conferences. And now we're starting to see different versions of B-Sides ICS pop up all over the world, which is really exciting. I do have just about every known OT or ICS cybersecurity certification, along with quite a few IT ones from back in the day. I also have my master's degree from the SANS Technology Institute with a specialization in ICS. I've also been very fortunate and honored to win a couple of awards from groups like the SANS community for their Difference Maker Award for OT ICS Defender for all of 2025, and Beer ISACs Award for being a community builder. But mainly I focus on posting on LinkedIn and YouTube, again, to help others understand how to secure OT and ICS. Because like we mentioned already, You have to look at what happens if that power plant goes down for a couple of days. Or what if that manufacturing plant that maybe it's not manufacturing, chocolate candy, but it's manufacturing insulin injections that people need to live? What would be the impact if that environment went down for a couple of days or a couple of weeks because of a cyber attack? That's why I focus on OT and ICS cybersecurity. These are just some of the environments I've been, again, very fortunate to be able to work in, from, again, power generation to transportation and subways and even bridges. Not a lot of control systems there, but some, and what they do have is extremely important to enforce safety. And then that bottom picture on the right-hand side, that's the LNGC facility up in Canada that we built for Shell, a $50 billion project. I was very fortunate to lead our company's efforts from an OT ICS cybersecurity perspective. But as I mentioned, I do post every day on LinkedIn content about learning how to secure OT and ICS environments. So if we haven't connected, definitely feel free to reach out, and you can always find me there after the course. And I'm also writing the book that goes as a companion piece to this course. You can find more information, including sample chapters from the book at guardinggears.com. So I created this course to help people understand how to secure OT and ICS from attackers, right? Because OT and ICS are everywhere in our lives, right? When we look at it, our families, our friends, our communities rely on OT and ICS every single minute of every single day, right? Whether we look at farms, right, that, yeah, bring food, right? Or we look at hospitals that bring medical care. Or what about refineries that we can use to create the different kind of components that we use in manufacturing to create different goods that we use? Of course, power plants that we use to generate the electricity that we use every day. What about making sure we have clean water to drink? Right? More food and agriculture, right? Like food processing plants. We want to make sure we have food that's safe to eat. When we look at, again, other types of manufacturing sites and plants, whether it's the chocolate candy or it's a Barbie doll, or what if it's for medicine or pharmaceuticals? We look at transportation, right? We want to make sure that we get safely and on time, but most importantly, safely, right, from point A to point B, right? OT and ICS is everywhere. You can even ask yourself, right, where else, right, you can see OT and ICS. Because once you start looking for it, you start seeing it everywhere. Of course, when we talk about OT, we also have to talk about IT as well. And I come from an IT background. I spent 25 plus years working in IT cybersecurity before I even started to get into OT cybersecurity back in 2010. And a couple things to think about, right, to keep in mind for now is that almost every OT environment, power plants, water treatment facilities, manufacturing plants, are almost always connected to some type of IT network. And it's usually the back office. And so you might have your power plant that's generating electricity, but at a minimum, it's sending data to the IT side of the house, the business side of the company, right? To explain, well, this is how much electricity we generated. So the business can understand how much revenue they're going to generate, right? How much money they're going to make. But they can also look at, well, we had to use natural gas and water to be able to create that electricity. So here's the amount of resources we used. So we have to understand, well, there was a cost associated with that we had to pay for. And then we can also watch the overall performance of all the different systems inside and the equipment inside that plant. So we can use that data to then determine, well, when do we need to do things like preventative maintenance? And we can use it to look to see, how well is the plant performing? And are there little tweaks that we can make inside the environment to make it operate, at a higher level of efficiency, right? To make it more efficient. So again, for now, think that almost every OT environment is connected to an IT environment. And that's where a lot of our risk comes from. Because if an attacker gets into the IT network and we don't prevent them from getting into the OT network, right? The attacker now is in our plant, and the attacker could potentially, right, have the capabilities to have an impact. Now, again, I kind of jokingly used the Reese's peanut butter cup example, right? But I wanted to add a little bit of fun to the course. And no, I'm not sponsored by, by Reese's in any stretch of the imagination for this. But what if we had that Reese's peanut butter cup manufacturing plant? Right? How can we protect it from a cyber attack impacting not only the operations of the facility, but most importantly, we want to make sure that everybody inside the facility stays safe. So, one of the reasons why I focus on growing awareness and education around OT and ICS cybersecurity is that we've seen a continued increase of attacks that are impacting either the OT environments directly, right, or the IT networks that the OT networks are connected to. Sometimes an attacker doesn't even need to get into the OT network to impact it. They just have to take down IT. Because if the OT network, right, if I have a manufacturing plant that receives its orders to manufacture a batch of, let's say, candy, and it gets that order from the IT side of the house. And let's say IT, like the entire environment, burns down with ransomware. If the IT network is essentially gone, then the manufacturing plant can't get the orders to manufacture anything. So you're down. That actually happened most recently with the Jaguar Land Rover company, where they lost all global manufacturing operations for a minimum of 5 weeks before they just started to get back up and running. And the attackers were never in the OT network. They were never in the car manufacturing plants, but ransomware burned down the IT networks, and manufacturing relied on IT. So attackers don't even need to sometimes get into OT networks to have an impact. So those attacks that are impacting OT, whether they're targeting OT directly or they're targeting the IT networks that OT are connected to, right? Those attacks are doubling every year for the last 5 years since the Colonial Pipeline incident that we're going to be talking about later. But again, we mentioned with Jaguar Land Rover, they were down for 5 weeks before they ever started to get back up and running. And again, that wasn't even an attacker getting into the manufacturing plants. It was an IT based attack. Where I really get upset is that there were almost or 200,000 people that were at risk of losing their jobs because of this incident. I would hate to be in any type of situation where I was responsible for the cybersecurity of a facility where someone lost their job, they got physically hurt, they were killed. Right? And that's what we're talking about a lot in protecting OT and ICS. Because we want to make sure, yes, that facility stays up and running, producing whatever it is supposed to produce. But our number one focus is always on safety. And then we look at the production, right? Making sure the plant stays up and running. And then I also do worry about, making sure people keep their jobs. So again, why are we here? The problem we still see is that there are some owners, right? The companies that own these plants, right? And the people that operate them, right? They don't still see themselves as targets. There's even some people that have jobs officially in OT and ICS cybersecurity working in some environments that still don't see themselves as targets, which is to me absolutely mind blowing. So our number one problem in OT and ICS around cybersecurity is a lack of awareness and education. That's why we're here. That's why I post on LinkedIn and YouTube. But then you also think of what's the impact again to the world or a community if that plant was to go down. Because sure, if a power plant went down for a couple of hours, we could live, without any issue, especially if our phones are charged, right? We're good. But when you start talking about days or weeks or months, that's a big difference, right? That's where, after weeks and months, that's where you start to see civilization breaking down. What about having access to clean water, food that's safe to eat, and reliable transportation, like making sure you have gas for your car, especially in the United States, or maybe in Europe and you rely on buses and trains to get from point A to point B. What if the trains and the buses aren't running? Or we think of what if we don't have the medicine that we need to live, healthy lives? So on this screen, what we're actually looking at is what we call an HMI or human machine interface, which is an OT or ICS system. And it acts as a GUI, right? It's a graphical representation of the environment. In this case, a water treatment facility, right? We take dirty water, we clean it, and then we send that clean water to the customers. So we have this HMI, right? We have this GUI interface that we can use to monitor the environment. And if we need to, as conditions change, right? Maybe we get an alert that there's a problem with one of the systems. A human operator can use the screen to make changes to the equipment out in the real world. That's the whole point of having OT, right? We're monitoring an environment, what's going on, and if we need to make changes, it gives us that ability. So when we look at this environment, and you might be looking at this and be like, I have no idea what the heck I'm looking at. And I get that totally. Because if I would have looked at this 10 years ago, I would have been like, huh? And that's the same kind of issue that attackers would have in OT. They might be able to gain access, let's say, to that water treatment facility, but they had no idea of what they were looking at, let alone have an idea to how could they create an attack to have some type of impact in that environment. Right? To be able to do that, you had to be an engineer that understood that environment and how you could create an attack to have some type of impact. But now with I can actually take this image, upload it to a platform like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and ask it, hey, review this HMI screen and tell me what's going on in this environment. And you know what? It does a really, really, really good job. I'd say it's like 99.5% of the way there. Where 6 months ago, you wouldn't have even got close, maybe 90 to 95%. Where today, we're almost already at 100%. Where it could take a screen like this and be able to interpret it and explain it to you in simple terms of, yeah, this is a water treatment facility and this is how it works. Where it's really interesting and concerning, though, is you can also say, well, look at this from the attacker perspective, or we can say, look at it from a pen tester perspective. Right? And pen testers, if you're not familiar, those are people that they have authorization to act as an attacker. So I can tell GenAI, hey, I have authorization to think and act like an attacker in this water treatment plant. What are some of the ways that I need to be aware that as a pen tester or an attacker, I could have an impact in the environment. Right? How could I shut down the environment so customers don't get any water? How could I do damage to the equipment so that way the water company has to replace that equipment and that might take days or weeks or months, which also results in customers not getting water. What about, and we've seen an attack like this, what if an attacker gets in the environment and puts a deadly amount of chemicals in the water? Now, thankfully, in the attack we saw, it was caught immediately by the operator in the environment, and they made a change, so no one was hurt, nobody was killed, but the potential is there. But again, now in 2026, you do not have to be an engineer, right, to be an attacker to have an impact in these environments. And think if you're a defender, and you're especially if you're just learning about securing OT or ICS. And if you come from the IT or IT cybersecurity side, don't be hard on yourself if you don't have an engineering degree, you don't have a triple PhD under your belt. It's okay. You don't have to. Now, if you are an engineer, right, that's awesome, right? If you're coming from an engineering background, or maybe you're from an automation background, maybe you're a PLC tech or a plant operator, maybe you're the plant manager. That's awesome because we need people from both IT and IT cybersecurity and OT and engineering and automation to all come together to be able to work to defend these environments. That's the only way this is going to happen because very few people that work in IT and IT cybersecurity actually care about OT cybersecurity. And very few people in OT, very few engineers and very few techs, right, and plant operators actually care about cybersecurity. So the only way we're going to be able to secure these plants from cyber attacks is for all of us to come together and work together to make it happen. It's no longer the IT side of the house and the OT side of the house. We all live in the same house under the same roof. And we're trying to do the same thing ultimately. So we need to be able to work together to make that happen. Now, throughout the course, you'll have different labs, and some sections might have one, two, or three labs. Most of the labs are hands on, right? They have a hands on component. In this first module, we don't necessarily have any hands on activity, but I also felt weird not having a lab for a module, right? And so this is where Reese's Peanut Butter Cups comes into place, right? Because there's actually a bunch of videos, but here's one of my favorite videos on YouTube that shows us, right, a factory that makes Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. So in the lab, you're going to sit there and watch the video. And while you're watching the video, ask questions like, how could an attacker have an impact in this environment, right? What would it look like? How do we make sure that our employees stay safe, right, in this type of environment? How could they potentially get hurt? How could they potentially get killed? Right? These are questions we ask in OT cybersecurity, which is very different in IT cybersecurity. We don't have conversations about people getting hurt or people getting killed in IT. But we do in OT or in ICS. And yes, even in a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup factory. Because there is danger there. There's risk. So keep those questions in mind, and as you watch the video, and you can see it's all of 11 minutes. It's not very long. And then as you start answering those questions and watching the video, then go back and start thinking about how would you answer those questions if it was a power plant or a water treatment facility or a manufacturing plant for maybe some type of service that the general public we need. Like, what if it was a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant? So that's going to be lab one. Again, I think it's just really to get you to start the thinking of not only how a manufacturing plant or an OT or ICS environment operates in the real world. Again, when we start asking those questions in OT, they're very different than IT, especially when it comes to safety and availability, right? Making sure the plant stays up and running. So when I initially created this course, I really wanted to write the class that I wish I had when I first got started in OT and ICS cybersecurity, right? The one I wish I had before I went to take any other courses or certifications. The one that would help me understand the basics. Right? I just needed a little help to get up and running. And that's really what this class is designed to be, that right? This high level introduction to different aspects of OT cybersecurity. We're not replacing any in-depth courses, right? I'm not replacing a week-long course on how to do incident response in OT environments, or a week-long course on penetration testing in OT or advanced defenses. Right? That's not what this is. It's designed to help you get up and running with the basics, the fundamentals of OT cybersecurity. And a lot of environments, that's all we have the time and resources to do. If you're curious, right, if you want to learn more about what the heck is OT or ICS and how do we secure it, I think this is a great resource. And maybe you start watching a couple of videos and realize, you know what, this isn't for me. And that's okay. At least you understand at that point what OT is and how it's important. And then there's others of you, right, that are going to watch this video and you're going to do OT and ICS cybersecurity until the day you die. But it doesn't matter, right? Whether you come from IT cybersecurity, OT, whether you're an engineer or plant operator or maybe a PLC tech, right? It doesn't matter where you come from. This course is designed to help you understand how to protect OT from cyber attacks. But for the course, we look at, again, the number one problem I see in securing OT and ICS environments today is a lack of awareness and education. That's why you're here. That's why I'm on LinkedIn. That's why I'm on YouTube. That's why I'm doing this video and creating this class and sharing it to help others understand the need for OT cybersecurity, right? And also get the education to understand how to actually secure it. And that it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be hard. And then also mention, again, another one of the problems we have is IT and OT teams often don't work together. Oftentimes they don't get along. And so this course is designed to help both IT and OT teams come together, right? To work together to be able to protect our environments. It's the only way it's going to happen. If we're not working together as one big team, then the only people that are winning are the attackers. Period. The end. Now, there's a lot of course materials that come with the class, right? And this is just some of them. So you can see I have a bunch of cheat sheets, or I usually call them quick start reference guides, right? So using different tools and understanding different protocols in OT environments, and right, the list goes on and on. And I have a ton of infographics. I've actually collected them into one location, and you can find them on my website at mikeholcomb.com. And then there's also a Google Drive location that has all of those shared out. So you'll have access to all of that through the course. There's over 300 review questions that come with the course. So there's just a few to practice, right? And kind of test your knowledge to see how you're following along with the materials. There's tons of tools and scripts that I've created with, and I'm not a developer, but over the last couple of years, I've created different simulations and scripts and different tools for OT cybersecurity using tools like ChatGPT and Gemini, right? And Claude. And then there's also the lab manual as well. So we already started talking about the first lab, right? Which again really isn't hands-on, but it gets you thinking. right? But the lab manual, the rest of the lab manual is all hands-on exercises, right? Emulating real examples of tasks that you're going to do in the real world that will help you understand how to secure OT environments. So let's take a quick peek at the different modules that make up the course. We're actually in module 1 right now, and we're going to finish that up right after this with a short conversation about the different cybersecurity certifications for OT and ICS. Then we'll jump into module 2. This is where we start talking about, really what is OT and ICS and how do we protect it from attackers? How do attackers have an impact in OT environments like power plants and manufacturing facilities? Once we move on that kind of that high level overview, then we'll start to dig into the different types of control systems like programmable logic controllers, safety instrumented systems, human machine interfaces, and some of the different protocols that we see in industrial environments like Modbus, S7, DMP3. Right? So if you come from an IT or IT cybersecurity background, this module is going to be very new to you. If you're coming from an engineering or a control systems background, you're like, yeah, I know all of this, right? And I get that. So if you have that background, you can skip module 3. In module 4, this is where we're going to start talking about how do we protect control system environments. And we start with asset registers. It's a fancy way of saying asset inventory to understand what we have in our environment. In module 4, we're going to talk about asset register, which is just a fancy way of saying asset inventory. And this idea that we have to have a list of all the systems in the environment and information about those systems, like the version of firmware that they're running. So we can use that to find vulnerabilities that we might or might not need to address. So asset registers play a key role in multiple areas of cybersecurity in OT environments. So that's why we start with asset registers. We're then going to get into secure network architecture. How do we build an environment to ensure it's protected as much as possible against attacks? That's what we're going to talk about, starting with that firewall between your IT and OT networks as that first layer of defense. But then we don't stop there. So where do we go from there? So that's module 5. Module 6, we're going to talk about the threats in OT and how do we manage them and looking at vulnerabilities. IT and OT cybersecurity have much more in common than they don't. Don't let anybody ever tell you they don't. But it is critical to understand where they are different and how they're different. And vulnerability management is one of those areas where IT and OT cybersecurity are very different. So we have to proceed cautiously here and work very closely between our cybersecurity teams and our engineering and operations teams to make sure that we're addressing vulnerabilities appropriately. And sometimes that means we're not doing anything about them. Or other times we have to shut down a plant to actually be able to make a change. Module 7, we're going to talk about using OSINT tactics for OT and ICS cybersecurity, especially when we look at a lot of control system environments still today have assets that are exposed to the internet. We see PLCs, we see HMIs, right, that are exposed to the internet, making them vulnerable to attack. Module 8, we're going to look at how incident detection and response work in OT. It's another one of those areas where very similar to how it works in IT at a high level. Right? But as you kind of get under the hoods and start really digging in, it can be very different. So it's important to understand how they're different. In Module 9, we're going to spend some time on how do we perform risk assessments in control system environments. This is one of the key components, kind of, or maybe the key pillars of OT cybersecurity to truly understand the risk that we have in the environment and how or if we're going to address it. And it helps us understand how do we work with the business to make those decisions. Module 10, we're going to talk about governance and compliance in OT and what does that look like, especially in our industrial environments that has there's very little regulation, especially in the United States and the rest of North America. There's very little regulation in the United States around OT and ICS, unlike in Europe where we see some more regulation. So we're going to talk about those laws and how that lends itself to things like governance and compliance. Module 11 is new to this version of the course, where we're going to spend some time talking about how do we integrate OT networks with the cloud. Why are we doing that for things like predictive analytics? Maybe I just want to use EDR, right? Endpoint detection and response in OT on my Windows machines. Yeah, there's actually Windows in OT networks. There's a lot of Windows in OT networks. Or when we talk about the industrial Internet of Things, which is just a fancy way of saying, yeah, we're going to hook up OT to the cloud, which is becoming more and more popular these days. And we can't tell the business no. We have to be like, okay, if we need to do this, let's do it as securely as possible. And that's what we're going to talk about there. The same principles apply when we start talking about, well, how do we use AI in Module 12? And AI is coming fast and furious for OT. But it's much more difficult to implement it in OT environments than it is in IT environments. So in that module, we'll talk about why that is. We'll talk about how we can work around it, right? And look at how do we secure AI in OT environments. And don't forget, as we go along throughout the entire course, we'll be looking at different examples of how we can use AI from an offensive and defensive standpoint. Of course, speaking of offensive security in Module 13, this is where we're going to talk about industrial penetration testing, right? How do we do pen testing effectively in OT environments? And this is just a high-level introduction. I have an entire course dedicated to just penetration testing in OT and ICS. So if you are really interested and fascinated with that module, you'll definitely want to jump over and check out that course. And then we wrap up with the course review. So we'll take a peek at some of those review questions that we mentioned, right? And we'll look at some other materials. We'll talk about what we had covered in the course. So there's a lot of information that we're covering. But I'm excited you're here. I'm excited to be here. Because on the previous version of this course, I get feedback every week from people talking about how it's helped them improve the security of their environment, or how it's helped them to get a job, or for some, how people have started companies after taking this course, which is just absolutely mind blowing. But it means everything to me to get that type of feedback, especially that it's helped people get jobs in securing OT and ICS environments. So before we wrap up the course introduction module, I want to make sure we touch on the main types of cybersecurity certifications that exist for OT and ICS. So up until now, there's only been two main paths, and now CompTIA is adding a third, which is great. So we're going to talk about those three main paths, and then we're going to also look at or talk about some of the other certifications out there that do exist. But the main path that we see most people take, and this is a good balance between the knowledge you get out of the course and the price, right? This is actually what we call the ISA IEC 62443 Cybersecurity Expert Series, right? That's a lot. Real quickly, when we talk about 62443, which we're going to talk about a lot in this course, 62443 is the gold standard in establishing a cybersecurity management program for your OT network. Right? So it's a standard, or really a family of standards that helps us understand how to build a cybersecurity program in OT. That comes from an organization which is ISA. And then they work with another organization called IEC. Right? We'll get into all the details in later modules in the course. But for now, I think that ISA actually has a series of 4 courses and 4 exams that you can take to get certified. You see, the first course that you take is called the Cybersecurity Fundamentals Specialist. And their courses, typically what they tend to be, is about half of the course teaches you the fundamentals of that one particular topic that the course focuses on. So this is cybersecurity fundamentals. And then the other half focuses on teaching you the basics of what 62443 is as this family of standards on how to protect OT. The risk assessment specialist. Remember, risk assessments are a key component to OT cybersecurity, especially in the 62443 world. So that's a big focus for them. We also can look at how do we design secure OT networks, or think, especially from a network perspective. And then that last course and exam follow maintenance. When we talk about operations and maintenance, think of what do we do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter, basis to help run that plant and keep it secure. Right? That's what those courses and exams focus on. Now, with 62443 through ISA, you have to take the course to take the exam. You don't have a choice. You can't just take the exam. Right? You have to do both. Right? I think right now, I think the cost is somewhere between like $2,200 and $2,400 to take the course and exam. If you are an ISA member, which is about $160 a year, then you can actually get a substantial discount where it's like $1,600 to $1,800 a year, talking about US dollars. And again, I realize that not everybody can afford, right, $1,600 even for a course. Right? But these are considered probably the more affordable path in getting a OT ICS cybersecurity certification these days, if that's what you need to do. There's a lot of people working in OT and ICS for years and decades. They'll never need to go get certified unless a client actually requests it. With the ISA 62443 series for the certification, if you do pass all 4 exams and you complete all 4 courses, then they give you what they call the ISA IEC 62443 Cybersecurity Expert Certification. I hate the title, right? Because nobody is an expert after taking a couple. It's like 2 weeks worth of courses and taking a couple exams. That doesn't make you an expert in anything. I love the idea of the roll-up certification, but let's call it maybe cybersecurity professional, not expert. Right? But that is the ISA IEC 62443 Cybersecurity Expert Series. Now, when we look at going to a class for the amount of knowledge you can get and the different instructors that you can work with real world knowledge, we always look to SANS. And they have some incredible courses with some incredible instructors. But they're also very expensive courses. A week with, SANS is 10 to 11,000 US dollars. And that is out of reach for most people, unfortunately. I've been very fortunate to take all of these courses as well as the ISA IEC 62443 courses. So the GICSP from SANS, that's their entry level course. Actually took mine back in, it was like 2014. But that teaches you the fundamentals of OT, ICS, cybersecurity. A lot of people kind of compared this course to the GICSP. And some people use this course as a study guide, right, to help them go past the exam. A few people might have even said, right, they actually passed the exam without taking the SANS course. They just used this class. And there's also a book I would recommend that you read, and we'll talk about that goes with that, because that book was written as a study guide for the GICSP exam. So there are alternate routes to get certified through SANS besides having to pay for the full class. Now, with the grid course, right, which is the best class I've ever taken, and I love Rob Lee that wrote the course. And if you're not familiar with Rob, Rob is the not only the CEO and co-founder of Dragos, but prior to that, he actually was the person responsible for establishing in the United States for the NSA, the National Security Agency, right? That he established a group that watched for state actors that were targeting OT environments. That was his job. And then he also spent time, a lot of people forget, he was also an attacker, right? He was an operator, right? He was breaking into industrial environments on behalf of the United States government. So especially when a state operator talks about anything, right? I'm listening. Right? And I want to ask this question, right? What is the number one thing I can do to keep you out of my OT network? And so I've had those conversations with Rob over the years, and that's a lot of that has gone into the courses. And so he's put so much into this course about helping people understand how to defend OT environments. And that, as he says, defense is doable. It doesn't have to be hard. So you can go into that course. I know I did, thinking how complex, right, that OT can be. And then I left and like, no, this really is doable. People just make it out to be harder than it really is. We can take a simple, practical approach to defending OT environments. And that's what we're going to talk about in this course. So if you get to take the grid course, take advantage of that opportunity. Even better, Rob actually still teaches it once a year live at the ICS Summit in summer every year. So definitely take advantage of that if you're able to, because you can't beat sitting in the classroom with one of, if not the world thought leader in this space and be able to just ask him questions and listen to his stories too. He tells a lot of stories. So, but that's grid, right? It's all about defending industrial environments. And then GCIP is written by Tim Conway, and Tim was one of the people responsible for building the NERC CIP, which is where the CIP comes from, the NERC CIP regulations, and that's regulations that governs power generation and transmission in North America, right? United States, Canada, and parts of Mexico. Anything tied into the main United States North American power grid. So it's really a class about how to build a cybersecurity program around NERC CIP and how to audit it. So that if you work in power generation and transmission, it's a class that you definitely would want to take. And it's another one you definitely want to take it with Tim if you're able to. And he also teaches it at the summit every year. So it's quite the group that you get in Orlando at that time every year. So, and then finally, again, we're just seeing CompTIA launch SecOT Plus. Right now, CompTIA is normally associated with the IT cybersecurity world. They helped me grow my career over the decades. So, I was really excited to hear them though creating this certification to help bridge, especially between IT cyber and OT cyber. I think a lot of the folks that mostly will take this are going to be folks trying to transition from IT cybersecurity to OT cybersecurity. There's definitely going to be some engineers and PLC techs and others responsible for operations and maintenance in industrial environments for sure that take it as well. That's probably like what we see with this class. It's about 60% within of folks with an IT cybersecurity background and 40% folks with more of an OT engineering type of background. Right. So that's just actually coming out in beta and then it goes live in December 2026. I'm really excited to see the momentum that it picks up and get the initial feedback from folks and see how it goes. But I have really high expectations for it. So, and it's it's one of those where it's a 450, I think, around there somewhere, about $450 exam, right? And there's not a lot of study materials out there yet, but I'm actually helping CompTIA create some. I'm also creating, study guides and videos on it for YouTube. So there'll be plenty of material at low to no cost for people to study and get prepared for the exam. So it's a very affordable approach to and getting, especially for some folks, right? Really getting that first foot in the door in OT cyber, and that's what a lot of folks just want. So I'm really excited about that. So I also put together kind of this roadmap or certification path, and this flow chart that you can see where if you want to look at, well, what cybersecurity certification should I look at? And you can see it, whether you're coming from IT or the OT world. Before you get into OT cybersecurity fundamentals, you really need to understand the basics of IT networking. Right? How do we connect systems together, especially over TCP/IP? We need to understand those fundamentals and then build into the IT cybersecurity fundamentals, which then gives us the opportunity to build into the OT and ICS cybersecurity fundamentals. So you can see it's a lot of CompTIA courses, right? Network Plus, Security Plus, SecOT Plus. And then once you've accomplished the SecOT Plus, then you're really able to go on to the next phase if you have the time and resources and you need to. Again, you might, if you're already working in a plant at this point and there's no other requirement for certification, you might not need to go to one of these classes unless you really want some of the additional knowledge, like going to grid, or if you work in power generation and transmission, and maybe somebody just assigns you responsibility for the NERC-CIP security program, then yeah, you might want to go take Tim's GCIP course. But when you look at, you can go down the ISA path or the SANS path. Again, really the biggest decider is how much money you have available. And I hate saying that that's the case, but that's really what it is. If you have all the money in the world, SANS is going to be your choice. If you don't have essentially that unlimited budget, then you're going to be looking at the ISA IEC 62443 path. So hopefully this roadmap will help you, find your own path on building those certifications if you need to, right? And helping you not only, build the certifications, but more importantly, help you build the knowledge that goes with the certifications. To wrap up, I just wanted to make a quick note about other resources that I've created that'll go along with the course that you can download and access as you go throughout the course. You can see, like, this is just an example of the ultimate resource guide. It talks about the books, the standards, the trainings, the free labs, the conferences, the certification, the podcasts that you can listen to learn more about OT and ICS cybersecurity. So there's a ton of resources that I have out there, and you can find a bunch either associated with this course, right, available for download, but also don't forget you can find all the other resources at my website at mikeholcomb.com. So thanks for coming to the first part, and I'll see you in part 2.